Now that we've got our caliper and our carrier assembly removed from our axle, we've moved over to our bench top vise so that we can hold our assembly to remove the caliper from the carrier. So what we're going to do is grab the caliper carrier assembly by the carrier itself, clamp it in the vise, and then remove the caliper. Now that we've got our caliper carrier assembly installed in our vise, the first thing that we've got to do is remove the cover cap from our long guide pin side. And this cap is pressed into place, so the easiest way to get it out is to protrude a punch through the center and then pry it out. Pretty easy to do. You can use a screwdriver or a pry bar. Just want to knock a hole. Pry the cap out. You notice the pin is all the way at the edge of the hole, so if you were to poke your device down through the edge, you're going to wind up damaging your caliper or your guide pin. So make sure to, when you puncture the cap, puncture it right in the middle. Now that the cap's been removed from our long guide pin, we need to remove two 14mm socket head cap screws from inside each of these two pins. So we've got an Allen wrench set up on a breaker bar. This is where I like to use the pipe because these are pretty tight here. Also, when we do this, you want to make sure to loosen and tighten the guide pin closest to the vise. If we were to try to loosen the guide pin opposite of your vise, what we normally see is the carrier gets twisted. We can actually deform the carrier or bend it ever so slightly if we're working away from our vise. So what we're going to do is we'll do the long guide pin side because it's closest to our vise. Then we'll flip our carrier around in our vise and do the short guide pin side. Now we're going to flip the caliper carrier assembly around in the vise to do the other end. Now that the assembly's been flipped around in our vise, we'll loosen the short guide pin bolt. And another note that we want to make here is that we're not supposed to use impact tools on these. We want to use hand tools so that we don't damage this guide pin system. My pipe. Now that both of the socket head cap screws are loose, we're going to remove the bolts from their pins and make sure you've got the caliper either supported or you're ready to move it, because once these are out, the caliper will be loose and be ready to sit it out onto the bench. We got both our bolts out. We're going to lift our caliper off of our carrier, sit it on our cart. Now that we've got our caliper removed from our carrier, you can see the bores where the guide pins mount into the carrier itself. You can also see the abutments where your brake pads ride. While this piece is off, what we need to do is make sure that there's no debris in either of these two bores. We also need to make sure that our pad abutments aren't worn very heavily. If we're planning on reusing our brake pads, we want to look at them to make sure they're not tapered, make sure they're wearing evenly. We also want to measure their thickness and refer back to the pad manufacturer's specifications to make sure there's plenty of life left before you reuse those. So we'll measure them, record the measurements, and then compare to the OE manual. And also, if we plan on reusing our brake rotor, we want to measure the brake rotor thickness itself, compare that to the manufacturer's recommended wear out limit to make sure there's enough life left in this rotor before we reuse it. We also want to inspect it for grooving, cracking, just to make sure it's in good condition before it's reused. Now that we've got our old caliper removed, what we want to do is get our new Webb aftermarket replacement caliper. We want to verify the part numbers of direct interchange, and all that information is listed on our website. So it's easy to go there, punch in your old part number, and then the website will give you the correct part number. So when we open up our Webb aftermarket replacement caliper, first thing we'll notice is it's got a detailed list of instructions. It's all set up by pictures, gives you torque specs, so all that's there, and we'll refer to those here in a little bit. Inside of the box, we've got a new caliper, and we also have what we call a fitting kit. So inside of the fitting kit, we have brand new guide pins, precision machined. We have brand new socket head cap screws. And notice there's a little bit of a difference here. So you've got a long bolt and a short bolt. The long bolt has thread locking agent on the threads already. These are set up and ready to go. Also, we have grease for our guide pins. We have a new bolt cap, a pin cover, so we'll have to press that in place. And then also a little retainer for the accordion bushings that go over the guide sleeve boots. So now that we've got the Webb caliper unboxed, what we want to do is make sure that the long guide pin, you can kind of see how it's longer on the left side here than it is on the right side. We want to make sure that our new caliper matches our old caliper. We want to make sure that that these are set up properly, because they are hand specific. So the left side of your vehicle, the calipers are going to be a little bit different than the right side, and mainly that's in where this long guide sleeve is. So as you can see here, our new one has a guide sleeve long on the left side in the orientation we're viewing it. So did our old caliper. So we're good to go. We're ready to mount this to our carrier. So I've rolled the caliper over so that we can easily insert the two new guide pins from our fitting kit. One thing that our recommended practices say is that we should use clean hands. And I'm filthy from disassembling our old caliper carrier assembly, so I'm going to wash up. That way I don't get any contaminants into our bushings and our guide pin system. So now we've got our new caliper out. It's turned upside down. We've got our guide sleeve fitting kit, all our parts laid out, and they're all clean and ready. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to grease up our long guide pin, and we're going to install it into the caliper itself. Easy to do. We'll squeeze out a little bit of grease. What we're going to do is spread this inside of the bushing and make sure it's evenly coated in there. We'll get that from both sides. And we'll also go ahead and put some in our short guide sleeve as well. Well, we got some grease here. Then after you get your bushings greased, you want to take a little bit more grease. You want to get our guide pins greased up real well. Once your guide pins are greased, you want to slide them from the back side in through the accordion bushing. Just float them right through. And then as they come out, you want to pop the lip of that bushing, or the lip of the guide sleeve, into the groove on that pin. So you can see there's a little bit of a lip here on our accordion bushing, and it's going to go into the groove on our pin. Sometimes it takes a little bit of work to get it to snap down in all the way. If it's not snapped in all the way, then the retainer, the white retainer ring, won't fit properly. Once you get it snapped in just like this, it's in the groove all the way, then you want to grab your retaining washer. And it's got a flat side and it's got a recessed side. You want to make sure your flat side's out, the recessed side is against your accordion style bushing. So we're going to snap that in place. So we got our retainer on our long guide pin. Now it's time to grease down our short guide pin, install it much the same way. So we'll get our grease on there, lube her up real good. And then the boss end will protrude from the outside to the inside so that this can pilot into our carrier. You'll notice both of the guide pins have a little boss on them, and that's what locates the caliper and the guide pins to the carrier assembly. Protrude those through, moves nice and easily. Both pins do, they float real nice. So now that we have both of these on here, we're ready to bolt our caliper back onto our old carrier. So we're going to get a friend, we're going to lift this up and install it back onto our carrier that's still in our vise. So now we're going to set our new caliper up onto our carrier, and we got to pilot the pins into these bosses on our carrier. So you got to kind of lift it up and work it in. You can kind of feel them drop down into place there. So now we're going to install our bolts. The long bolt with the Loctite on the threads goes in the long guide pin. It'll drop right down in there. Use my socket to get her started. Short bolt in the short guide sleeve. Get it going. Then we'll use a ratchet to snug those up just barely tight. Now that we've got both of the socket head cap screws snug, we're going to use our torque wrench to torque them down to 133 foot-pounds, which is roughly 180 Newton meters. We'll make sure it's set correctly. Yep, 133, and we're only going to torque the guide pin closest to our vise so we don't twist our carrier. Now that we've got the short guide pin torqued, our instructions tell us to go ahead and tighten this bolt 90 degrees additionally. So we use our breaker bar, we use our cheater pipe so that we can really get some leverage on here. We're going to note the orientation of the pipe relative to the carrier so I know exactly when to stop. "90 degrees, easy enough." Now we're going to turn our caliper carrier assembly around in our vise and do the same torquing procedure for our long guide pin. Now that our assembly is flipped around in the vise, we're going to use our torque wrench again, set to 133 foot-pounds. We're going to torque the socket head cap screw in our long guide pin. Now we'll use our breaker bar and our pipe to turn it an additional 90 degrees. That has both of those guide pins properly installed. And now that we've got the bolts in, we can reinstall the new cover over the long guide pin sleeve. And according to our instructions, it must be installed flush. So here's the new cap. It just drives right down in the hole. So to install the cap over the long guide sleeve, we're going to drive it flush. Some folks use sockets, some just tap it in there with a hammer. I've got a little piece of round steel stock that I found that it works pretty good. Just line it up, make sure you hold it nice and square, drive it in evenly. If you get it cocked, you'll wind up damaging the cap. You may need a replacement if you damage it badly. And the real reason for this is to keep water and debris out of these guide pins because they have to float. They can't have rust or dirt in them. So this keeps them clean. Go, pretty good there, nice and sealed. Now that we've got our caliper mounted to our carrier, we're ready to install this assembly back onto our axle end. So we're going to get a friend, we're going to lift this up, get it out of the vise, get it back onto our axle, and essentially reinstall it in the reverse order that we removed everything.